Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you may be. Welcome to today's webinar. We have a series of webinars that are going to appear over the next few weeks, which are application focused webinars, where we're going to talk about some of our products, but rather than speak directly just sort of tech specs, we're going to look at specific applications and how some of our systems are really well suited to be deployed in those specific applications, and some tips and tricks and nice tools to make them really flexible to suit those applications. So first of all, thanks everyone for joining. We will of course have a Q&A session at the end if you have any questions, but please don't hesitate to ask any questions in the question box, and we'll feed those through towards the end of the webinar and do our best to answer as many questions as we can. So as I mentioned, we will be talking about House of Worship today, and then we'll have future application focus webinars, which will touch on applications like Broadcast, Studio. We'll have another one or two House of Worship focused webinars as well. And we will also touch on some live applications as well sometime in the future. So I'm going to start today. We're talking about House of Worship, and more specifically, we're talking about Avantis as a really flexible and powerful tool for House of Worship. Now, in many ways, House of Worship or mixing sound for House of Worship is similar to mixing any live sort of media, but it does have some special specificities where having the right tool and being able to configure the system in the right way really gives you an advantage or makes your life easier in relation to how things work in House of Worship, where things are a little bit different. So what I wanted to do to start off with is go over the tech specs of Avantis as well. Maybe some of our attendees are interested in Avantis as a platform for their House of Worship. So I just wanted to go over some of the technical specifications of Avantis so we're all kind of on the same page. So I'll just bring this up there. You should have this. So today we're talking about Avantis, which is one of the more recent mixing systems we launched towards the end of last year. So just looking into those specifications really quickly, Avantis is a 64-channel mixing console. So that means that we can mix 64 channels of audio at any given time. We can connect many more physical inputs, and we'll look at that in a second, but it's a 64 mixing channel console. It also has 42 configurable buses. Now, what we mean by configurable buses is that we have 42 available buses, and we can set up the mixing console to be to have, out of 42 of those buses, any number of mono or stereo auxes, matrices, groups, master left right outputs. So within 42 buses, you can configure that however you like. You might have 20 stereo aux sends, or you might have 10 mono groups and 10 stereo groups, and so on and so forth. So you can really configure it for your application. So if you've got a lot of stereo in-ear monitor mixes, you'll need a lot of stereo buses. If you're mixing front of house, you might want a lot of groups to do bus compression for various sections of your mix. So you can really configure the bus architecture to match your application or what you need. Avantis is based on our XCVI processing core. So what does that mean? It means that rather than using DSP hardware inside the mixing console, we've designed our own processing core, which manages all of the audio processing. And that comes with a certain amount of advantages. We'll touch on that very briefly. Avantis is also deep enabled. What that means is by purchasing the D pack, which adds a certain amount of capacity to the console, you have access to the deep processing, and we'll touch on that very briefly as well. But it's essentially all of the compressor emulations, preamp emulations, and graphic EQ emulations that you have on DLive and SQ as well. Avantis also has 12 stereo effects engines. So these effects engines can run a really wide variety of effects. So all your reverbs, your delays, your chorus, pitch, shifter, etc. So there are 12 separate effect engines in the console that you can use at the same time. And these effect engines have their dedicated stereo return input channels. So you're not using any of your 64 mixing channels for your effects returns. Those are on top. So there are 12 stereo effects returns as well. So again, without going into an Avantis presentation, the XCVI processing core. So what's the difference between XCVI processor and DSP? Well, essentially it's next generation processing core. So rather than using DSP chips like older generation technology, in the same way that you have a processor inside your computer, which might be an AMD or an Intel doing all the processing, all of the audio processing in Avantis is done in our FPGA processing core. So this is a 36 parallel processing core. It's just got oodles of power for advanced processing, and it gives you a few major benefits. The major benefit, number one, is that the system runs at 96 kilohertz full time. So your processing is always happening at 96 kilohertz. One of the other main benefits is what we call mixed coherency. So again, very briefly, mixed coherency means that I can take an input like physical XLR input to a physical XLR output, or I can take an input, run it through the most complex processing path in the console, through an input processing, then to a group, do some processing on that group, send that to a matrix, do some processing on that matrix, and then send that to a physical XLR output. And the first straightforward input to output and the very complex input to output paths arrive in time, so they're fully phase coherent. Now, this can be used for advanced complex mixing techniques like parallel bus compression and things like that. But what's most important is that this mixed coherency is always on. It always exists. It's not a mode that you have to switch on. You don't have to understand complex time alignment techniques, etc. So whether you're a very advanced engineer or whether you're maybe a less skilled entry-level engineer, you can still benefit from all these tools without having to think about really complex workarounds and how to make them work. What's really nice, thanks to our FPGA processor, is not only is everything fully mixed coherent, but it's fully mixed coherent at 0.7 milliseconds. So the time that it takes from the signal to go from an XLR input to an XLR output, even through a very complex routing and processing signal flow, is extremely low. This means it's fantastic for in-ear mixing, low latency applications for that sort of thing. So let's look about a little bit at the physical aspects of Avantis really quickly. So on the back of an Avantis console, a few things that you'll probably know what they are. First of all, we've got 12 analog mic pre or line inputs and 2 stereo AES outputs. Sorry, back to front. 12 analog mic pre's or line inputs and 1 stereo AES input, and 12 analog outputs and 2 stereo AES outputs. On the back, you'll find a USB port for transferring your recordings, doing anything like firmware updates, and also storing any of your shows or libraries directly to a USB key. We then have 2 128 by 128 in-out card slots. These are compatible with the D-Live I/O cards. So in these slots, we'll be able to put anything from Dante cards, Waves cards, MADI cards, GigaAce cards if we want to interface with other Allen Heath mixers, etc. So a lot of capacity to connect more ins and outs to the surface. We then have, just get my mouse up here, a network port This network port is where we'll be able to connect perhaps a wireless access point for iPad control, etc. And we'll look at a little bit later on how we can use this network port to connect custom control to develop customized control surfaces for Avantis. We have a word clock in-out if we want to sync to other devices or send clock to someone or receive clock from someone else. And then finally, we've got an S-Link port. Now, if any of you use our SQ mixing platform, you'll be familiar with our S-Link port. S-Link is a self-detecting port which allows you to connect to any of our stage racks from our Everything IO family. So there are many, many different stage boxes, whether it's the GX4816 or any of our DX boxes, but also the older generation AR and AB 48 kilohertz stage boxes as well. So the S-Link port on the back of Avantis will automatically detect the format of the box you're connecting. So if you connect a DX box, that S-Link port will automatically switch to DX mode. If you connect an AR or an AB box, it will automatically switch to AR or D-Snake mode, if you like, and be able to talk to those boxes. The only caveat thing that you need to know about that is we can't mix two different types of boxes together. So I can't put a DX and an AR box in daisy chain. That won't work. It's one mode or the other. So one of the boxes which is really well suited for Avantis by its kind of form factor and its capabilities is the GX4816. So as the name says, it's a 48 input, 16 output stage rack. It is compatible with SQ and now DLive, but also Avantis as well. So you connect this with a single cable to the S-Link port on the back of Avantis with a Cat5e or above cable, and it gives you 48 inputs and 16 outputs. It also has 2 DX ports on the front panel as well, which are just here. Now, these DX ports allow you to connect an extra 32 by 32 inputs, outputs with a DX box. So I could put a DX32 or a DX168 on each of these ports and have up to 32 by 32 IO on each of these ports. So that gives you a lot of capability in terms of inputs and outputs. And it also allows you to have maybe the GX4816 side of stage and take a couple of smaller stage boxes out, one for the drum riser and one for front of stage, for example. So it's a really nice and practical way to distribute your IO. Now, one last thing, which is again quite important for Avantis and quite important for House of Worship, is the capacity for the 4816, the GX4816, on the second DX port to also connect our Mi personal monitoring system. So our personal monitoring system, there's the Mi 1 and the Mi 500, which are slightly different monitor controllers, are a personal monitor mixing system. So you can give one of these Mi units to each musician on stage or to each person on stage, and they'll be able to mix their own in-ear mix that will feed a headphone output on the back of this unit. So they can plug their in-ears into this unit and they can set their own levels of drums, guitars, keyboards, vocals, etc. for themselves. Now, this is really practical for House of Worship applications where each musician wants to really dial their own thing in without having the need for extra staff, monitor engineers, etc. So it's a really nice application, but it's also very easy to deploy. If you're not going down the Mi personal monitoring system route, you also have the option, as I mentioned earlier on, to put a wireless access point into the network ports of Avantis and use one of our iPad mixing apps. So either Mixpad for mixing as an engineer or One Mix for personal monitoring systems. Okay, so Avantis does have the option to add the DPAC package. This opens up a range of extra tools, notably tools that you'll find on DLive to offer more processing power to Avantis should you so want. The DPAC offers you 16 Dynate dynamic EQs and multiband compressors, and we'll take a look at those in a few minutes. but it also offers you all of the deep compressor emulations, the 16T, the 16VU, the peak limiter 76, and as well as the dual stage preamp. And you also get the graphic EQ emulations, but those you can get for free if you register your Avantis online on purchase. So lots of nice tools, and we'll have a quick peek at some of those in a little while. So what I wanted to share with you now is earlier this week I spoke to Andrew at SFL, who are a UK-based integrator, and I spoke to Charlie from Welcome Church, who is the production lead for, I think it's the first church that installed an Avantis console in the UK, possibly maybe in Europe. So I had a call with them at the beginning of this week, and they talked about their experience of installing Avantis and how that went for them. And Charlie shares a little bit of his insight of having used Avantis over the past few months. So I'm going to share that video with you now for you to have a look at, and then after that I will talk a little bit about some of his workflow and show you on Avantis how all that works. So I'm going to roll this, and hopefully you can enjoy this video for the next 10 minutes or so. Charles, Andrew, hi. Nice to speak to you. Maybe Andrew and Charles, you want to tell us a bit about yourselves, what you do, and where you work. So Andrew, if you want to go first.
Hey, I'm Andrew Hardiman. I'm a project manager at SFL Group based in Reading, and I work across the installation and production sides of the business.
Fantastic, thank you.
So my name's Charles. I'm the production lead for Welcome Church, and I'm quite heavily involved with the production sides and sort of technical aspects of what we do at Welcome.
Great, fantastic. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Welcome Church, the size of the venue, the sort of different events that you might have over the space of a normal week, and how things have maybe changed a little bit over the past few months and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So Welcome Church is based in the heart of Woking. We're a sort of charismatic church, I guess. So not a traditional stone building. For those that perhaps aren't familiar with church, we're more of a, I guess, a modern setup. The size is about 800 or thereabouts. It sort of fluctuates, and obviously now, given the situation, it's it's difficult to say.
So recently you've gone through a refurb. I imagine that's kind of a whole package, from what I understand from Andrew, not just upgrading your console. So
yeah,
you've got a few new
absolutely.
bits.
We've been very blessed in the last, I guess, 2 years. This building project's been going on, that we've actually extended from our original capacity in that building, which was about 250, as I said, to 750 all in one building, and we've still got the existing building left. During that design phase, we wanted to upgrade and up the ante on our PA system in all aspects. So obviously, buying the Avantis was one sort of consideration, but also we wanted a decent quality sound for the audience. We wanted a decent experience for the worship team that were up the front doing the music, as it were. And that was all sort of all encompassing. So the lighting, the sound, by which I mean the actual amplification, and just the setup overall. So
Sure.
With a larger venue, you would want that better experience.
Yeah. So you've gone through the process of kind of ticking all the boxes to have a state-of-the-art system from front end all the way out to the loudspeakers, I guess.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we, in every stage, I mean, and of course, whenever you're planning these things and designing it and consulting with contractors like SFL, and Andrew's done a great job there, budget and price is always a consideration. As much as I'd love to spend millions of pounds, we needed to make decisions based on what we could, what we're actually going to be using it for in the future, and not go crazy, but at the same time get the best quality equipment that we can with the money that we had. So that was sort of where Andrew's expertise came in, and doing what he does at SFL.
Sure, fantastic. So, how did the choice of Avantis come about? Was that a joint consideration, or is that something you already had your eyes on beforehand? How did that work between SFL and the church?
So I think initially what swung it for us was the familiarity with the workflow. So traditionally, certainly since I've been there, the last sort of 7 or 8 years, we've always used Heath gear, because we have people who are not professionals. The familiarity with that workflow and with the systems and the setup is the decision that sort of swung it for us. But also, I mean, in that as well, it's a good brand, it's solid, reliable, been around for a long time. And also, I think it's very competitive as far as the functionality and the capacity that you get. We still own 2 GLD 112s, and actually, the Avantis was sort of a natural progression to enabling the team to upgrade, but also have something that they can still work with, but isn't completely fresh to them. That kind of stuff, yeah.
Okay, maybe a little bit of detail on the integration side. So I see you've got an Avantis, obviously, that's working front of house, a GX 4816 stage rack, which is doing all your inputs. How did that go in terms of actual technical integration? Maybe, Andrew, you can touch a bit on that. I have a feeling you might not have a lot to talk about in terms of how complex or simple the integration went when you were actually installing the product.
Ultimately, it's really easy. The GX has so we connect the Avantis straight to the GX on the S-Link port on the Avantis. We can then loop out of the GX into the existing ME system, which the church already owns. So another reason to continue with Avantis was the church are fully up to speed with the MEs. They love using the MEs. So staying in the Allen and Heath ecosystem really made a lot of sense. So using the BX outputs on the GX 4816 meant we could loop out to the MEs and also loop out to another DX 16.8, which lives in the rack room, which takes all the inputs from the radio mics, fits on a single cable, and then off we go.
Yeah. So installation time, sort of from opening the box, was fairly swift.
Minutes.
Cool. It's a bit tricky because you want to talk about complex technical things, but it's literally is plug and play. And I mean, I'm sure you're aware, when we connect 2 stage racks to a console, they do their firmware update automatically. So you can take, a stage rack that's been on the shelf for a few weeks or a few months, and a console that's fresh out the factory, it will automatically update. So you mentioned, Andrew, that the church was using ME systems before with your GLD, and as you mentioned, it literally is plug and play from the old system to the new system. Charles, I imagine it was just a question of working through your input list and then doing some repatching of what needed to go back to the ME units?
Yeah, it's literally just a matter of minutes trying to work that out, really, and then document it, of course, for the next person that has to use it. So yeah, very, very, very simple. And as I said, the band are very used to using the ME system. They love it. They can change things. And as well on the sort of production side, in a church setting, it just saves me from doing one extra job, which is having to deal with 8 people on stage and going, oh, can you turn this up? Can you turn this down? They can do it themselves. It's very sort of self-fulfilling.
Fantastic. And so very briefly, how, in terms of pure workflow, so we've talked a lot about kind of the technical aspects, setup and deployment. In terms of workflow, so maybe if you could touch on how the transition from GLD to the Avantis felt, for you the first time.
When it comes to the actual layout of the board, as it were, that is very flexible. You can put things anywhere you want. You can set up user groups. So, for example, my personal preference is to have everything down at the bottom level, so I can just press 2 buttons and all the faders come down, and that's my live setup. Another person might like it another way, and that's fine. We can set those up. So yeah, for anyone that's perhaps thinking of purchasing it, there is, of course, always a new learning curve with technology. It's not overly complicated by any means. You can take it to as complicated or as simple as you'd like it, really. From the transition from the GLD system to the Avantis, first of all, there's greater capacity, so there's greater inputs for us. And that was a real key selling point, because we would consider going down the greater route of the D life, and that's all very well and good, but it was just a little bit overkill, and perhaps, as I said, you always have to have these budget considerations in mind. But yeah, the Avantis is familiar if you've been using the GLD system, certainly, but of course it's had a refresh. The touch screens are amazing, HD, very, so you've got capacitive touch, I think, and that's really helpful to sort of select things with 2 fingers, and if you're doing patching, it's really helpful to drag and stuff. So yeah, I think it's great. It definitely feels familiar for me to come away from that GLD ecosystem, but with a fresh touch and extra features as well.
Okay, and then on a pure kind of maybe a little bit more subjective question, is there something like a favorite feature, something that you really enjoy on the console, maybe in workflow or in your setup, in your own kind of personal little thing that you do that, gets you around a challenge?
So my favorite feature at the moment, and certainly is relevant for our current situation, is the virtual sound check. So, we bought the, I think it's the 32 by 32 Dante cards. And for me, when we do a multi-track recording, to just double check that everything's au fait and it works through that virtual sound check is perfect for verifying that the recording's actually taken correctly. The second to that as well, it's really good for training. So, as I said, we don't have professionals that use this system or use equipment every day in, day out, and having that multi-track recording function virtualized onto the desk means that we don't have to have a band sitting around waiting for me to explain things. We can just put it through, bang, it works, and yeah, so far it's been flawless. Yeah, it's a great desk to use. I'm very happy with it.
Fantastic. Yeah. Good to hear. Great. Well, I think that covers most of the topics. Again, I'm glad to hear that you've made a great progression from the GLD, that you stayed with the family. It makes a lot of sense, both technically, being able to reintegrate with the Me system, but also in terms of workflow. Like you said, for volunteers, people who are not so technically skilled, they kind of find their feet fairly quickly. But no, it's been really good, really great talking to you. And thanks very much. Cheers. Okay, so that was the really nice conversation I had with the guys at Welcome Church and SFL earlier on in the week. So I hope maybe that answers some of the questions that you might have about Avantis in your application. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to touch on some of the topics that Charlie mentioned, his kind of features that he enjoys the most on Avantis that I have right next to me. So I'm just going to switch over here. Excuse my there we go. Okay, so you guys should have a view of Avantis on screen now. And so the first thing that he mentioned was that they have different skill levels of people, and I think maybe in House of Worship that's maybe one of the most important things to focus on, is that you can have a really wide range of people working who need to have access to audio, and that can be from a highly skilled engineer who's done many large format events, who knows his way around the most complex mixing console, but it can also be the janitor, or somebody who gets scared just by looking at a mixing console, and to give them tools where they can still have access to some features and functions, I find is really important. So we'll look at that in a minute. Now, the first thing that Charlie mentioned for him that was a great tool is virtual sound check. So the capacity to record a performance and play it back into Avantis at the touch of a button. Now, that's really good, as he mentioned, to check all his signals, make sure all his mics are in the right place and there's no problems. You know, once the people who are on stage have left, that he can check through all of his systems to make sure everything's working. But also because he's working with a lot of volunteers and people who might want to increase their skill level in mixing, the capacity to use virtual soundcheck to play audio back into the system with no time constraints and work on the mixing console. So I'm just going to show you really quickly. Hopefully, yeah, you got my hands here. So right now we've got physical microphone inputs coming into Avantis, and you can see that because at the top row here on the console, I've got all of my gain levels, and if I press them, it gives me preamp settings as well. So I can see I've got physical XLR inputs across the top here. Now, if I go into my I/O patching page, sorry, I'll just zoom that out a little bit, and my virtual
Val,
sound check.
sorry to interrupt you. I think we just lost your webcam.
Oh dear. Completely? It's gone?
Yes. There you go. You're back now.
Okay, I'm back now.
Carry on.
The joys of life. Thank you. Okay, so here I'm on the virtual soundcheck tab, which is at the top of my I/O page. And what I can do is very quickly, I can take all of my input channels that are named here, which are kick, snare, hat, etc., and I can patch them directly to my Dante card. In this case, it's a Dante card that is inside Avantis. So when I press record send, all of my input channels are going to be sent directly to that card, and then over Dante I can record onto whatever DAW I might have on my laptop. So one button and I'm recording everything. And then at the press of a button, I press virtual soundcheck, and now I'm in virtual soundcheck mode. And if I come back to my bank view, you'll see here that I've got no more preamp control because I'm receiving the return from my DAW recording software directly into the same channels. So where I recorded my kick drum to a kick channel, it's now coming back to the kick channel on the Avantis. So one button, I go in and out of virtual soundcheck or record mode. So that's really fast and intuitive. I don't need to repatch all of my inputs one by one from my DAW software. It's literally one touch and I'm there. So that's a really nice fast workflow tool. The next thing he mentioned was the capacity to be able to completely configure his surface in the way he likes. So right now what I've got, and maybe you can see it and maybe I can come in a bit closer, there we go, is I've got, oh sorry, there we go. Come on, there we are. So kick, snare, all of the drums laid out, then I've got bass. If I flick down to the next layer of faders, I've got my guitars, my pianos, and if I go down to the next layer, I've got all of my vocals, the background music, etc., etc. So I can change that layout however I want, and that's really straightforward. Just by going to the setup page, here is my bank of faders, so I've got kick, snare, etc., and I can drag anything I want. So if I want to have my bass guitar down here, the first channel has now become my bass. So I can configure this however I like. And this is really useful because you can lay out the system to be more or less complex depending on who's using the console. So in certain applications, maybe in a daytime event, and I've got a scene set up here where there's only some music coming from a playback system and I need to be able to turn the lectern up and down, then I can have a very simple layout where all it shows is the lectern microphone and the music. So somebody who's not so skilled, they know that it's just those two faders and they can turn it up and down and they're never going to mess something up that they don't need to. So you can simplify the workflow quite substantially to suit whoever's working on it. And then the other thing I wanted to show you really briefly on this is the quick grab tabs, what we call the quick grab tabs. Now these are the three rotaries on the right hand side of the screen, and you've got these three rotaries on both screens. So the other screen as well also have those rotaries. And each of these rotaries can be assigned to any function I like. So for example, I might want to assign it to the lectern mic. So the pastor, whatever happens, whatever I'm on, if someone starts speaking, I can be in any page, I can be messing with the effects, whatever. If he starts speaking and I need to turn it up, I can just go and grab that rotary and it's always there. Okay, so that's easy to configure. I go into setup, custom rotaries, and then I take the first one and I set it to preamp, for example, gain, and I lock it to a channel. So I lock it to a channel, inputs, the pastor was on 32, so I lock it to 32, and I apply, and then I have that gain for that at any given time. It should be at least. Oh, it's because I'm not on an analog input, that's why. But yeah, so I can have that gain directly on that rotary at the just by grabbing it at any given time if I want to. So that's a really nice function to have available as well. Moving on, a nice little tool that I wanted to show you is the capacity to do side chains. And again, for House of Worship, this is something that I find is a really nice tool. Again, so what do I mean about side chains? So it's the capacity to compress a channel based on another channel. So what I've done here, for example, if I set up a group, and in this group, I've assigned all of the music. So the drums, the keys, the guitars, everything has been assigned to this group. So this group is all of the music except for the pastor's microphone. And what I can then do is I can go into my compressor and I can tell this compressor to be triggered not by that channel itself, but by another channel. So by going to the sidechain source and selecting that microphone, so I'll just scroll down there and go to lectern, apply. Now this compressor will trigger only when that lectern mic is being used. So basically what it's going to do, if I set a small ratio on here, is when the pastor starts speaking, it will slightly compress the music group. So all of the music will go down just a tiny little bit to make a little bit of space for that vocal, which is kind of the most important part of your mix in this application. So it's a really nice tool again to be able to have access to that very quickly, very simply, without having to do any complex routing, sending the music to a group, that group to another bus, that bus is the input. It's really easy. You can just grab it and activate that here. Okay, so that's a couple of the tools that I really like and I find that are really quite practical on Avantis to work fast in terms of workflow in your mix and stuff like that. There's another thing that for me really makes Avantis a really good tool for House of Worship, and that's the capacity to use custom control to design customized work layouts depending on your application. And not only depending on your application, but depending on your user level. So Custom Control is a free to download app, and that app works on iOS devices, Android devices, it works on Mac computers and on Windows computers. It's accompanied by a custom control editor where you can design the work layouts that you want, the way you want to customize them. So what I've done is I've designed one here, and I'm just going to bring that up on screen. Hopefully you should have this. There we go. So this is an app layout that I've designed, and this layout is uploaded into the Avantis using the custom control editor. And I can design this however I like. I can put rotaries, I can put faders, I can press buttons, I can put a different background onto it if I want to. I can really customize the layout however I like. And we do have a custom control webinar available to look at to see exactly how to design stuff on custom control. But what this means for House of Worship applications is that I can design a touchscreen interface that really suits whoever might need access to the system without making it over complex. So what have I done here? Let me show you really quickly. So I've created 3 soft keys that might be on an iPad that anyone can access. One is live, so this is for when there's live music or live on stage. One is for daytime, so during the day, you know, the room, the church might be empty, but there's a few people in and out, there's some little groups, whatever. And another one is there's only going to be somebody talking on the lectern, so we don't need to see all of the input and output faders, etc., etc. So with this touchscreen, I have access to only the things that I need. So what's going to happen is if I'm in a live environment, I press the live button and it launches that scene on Avantis. And then whoever's operating the system can turn the level of the lobby matrix up and down. They can turn a secondary room, like a breakout room maybe, up and down. This is the feed from the live console to that room. And then there's a shortcut for the background music. So in between services, you've got that fader available to turn the background music up and down without having to find it again on the pages of the console or whatever. Now, during the daytime, there's no skilled engineers in the venue. Nobody knows how to operate the mixing console. So all they need is to have access to a couple of functions. So they turn up and they look at this and they say, oh, it's daytime, so I can trigger that daytime scene. That comes up and you can see the layout has now changed, and all they have is the music feed. So they're turning up, like it might be a Spotify playback loop, or it might be, you know, just a CD player that's looping around background music track. And for them, it's really simple. Avantis can have its cover on. They don't need to touch it. They don't need to look at it. It's just doing its mixing thing all by itself. All they need is to be able to turn the music up and down, and they can do that. It's not scary for them. It's not intimidating, and they can't make any mistakes. And then maybe in the afternoon, there's a team meeting and somebody wants to go up on stage and talk to a few people. How do we switch on the console? How do we make it work? It's a bit complicated. It can be really simple. So they can have the iPad that's available. They press the speech, and again, the layout changes, and they can turn the lectern microphone up and down. They can turn background music up and down as well. And again, it's really simple. There's no more buttons and keys and stuff than they need to have, but they can have access to the tools that they need without it being too complicated. So for me, custom control is a really powerful tool, really specific to House of Worship to ease your workflow. As I mentioned, the custom control editor and the custom control app are completely free to download. So if you want to look at how that works and the sort of things you can associate with custom control, please feel free to download that from our website and have a look and play around and see the sort of layouts that you could design. It's really quite intuitive and fun to use as well. So on that, I've kind of come to the best part of the topics I wanted to mention. So I'm going to ask my colleague Nick, who's been on the sideline for the best part of the webinar, and forwards any questions you might have that we might be able to answer for you about Avantis in House of Worship applications.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there are some good questions in here. I've
Great.
answered some of those behind the scenes offline.
Okay.
And I think I'll pick up some of the questions that are most related to the House of Worship application, and a couple on some of the features you just showed a minute ago. So one is when you showed that you can choose to display only a few strips or channels on your console to simplify the use for some of the operators. Someone is asking, are the other channels still working and passing audio even if they're not on the surface?
They are absolutely still there. So it's when we change fader layouts, it literally just the displayed channels on the work surface, if you will. So all of the other channels are still passing audio. I can, if I'm using, for example, matrices to just distribute audio into multiple rooms around the venue, and I want to make sure that nobody touches those, I can hide them off the surface so nobody's going to change sort of distribution levels, but they're still there. They're still working. They're still active. They're still routing and processing. They're just not available for people to touch. So yeah, it's literally in terms of visibility and access to the faders, but all of the functions, the parameters, the processes are still happening in the background, even if they're not displayed.
Yep, thank you. And Matthew is asking if you can set up an aux bus, a monitor bus for the worship minister, for example, for in-ear monitoring, so that it's post-EQ pre-compressor, but still following the fader, so still post-fader. So can you choose the source options for the aux and then set the aux as post-fader?
Yes. Post EQ. Write that down.
Post EQ pre-compressor, but it still wants to adjust the volume on the fader.
Post EQ. Sorry, I need to think of it while I'm doing it. There we go. Post EQ pre-compressor. Is that right?
Yep.
So I need to think about this. Yes, so post EQ pre-compressor is possible, and then pre-fader is possible as well. So yes, that's absolutely possible.
Thank you, Val.
Welcome.
You can also, Matthew, you can also have a look at the block diagram and the reference guide online. Those will give you more information on which source points you can select for your auxes and so on. There was a question earlier about user profiles and permissions. So you mentioned that you can set up the console for different use cases and operators. How would you go about setting different passwords and permissions to limit or lock some features out of
Sure,
the...
absolutely. Well, maybe the best is if I come back to Avantis here, and I'll just zoom in a little bit further. There we go. Sorry, there we go. So in the setup page, there we go. You've got that, yep.
Yep.
And config tab and user profiles. I can set up to 10 different users. Okay, and each user can have a different name. Obviously, it can have a password. I can put some notes on it to say you've got access to this or not access to that, for example. I can limit it to certain scenes. So if I create a user, make that active, I can say that user profile can only recall maybe the daytime scene to make sure they can't recall the live event scene and mess stuff up and overwrite it. So they can only recall this scene. And then with the set permissions tab here, I can choose setup parameters that they can access, scene and show memories that they can access, so I can prevent them from overwriting stored scenes and stuff like that. I can allow them or prevent them from doing routing stuff, channel processing. I can give them access to output bus processing, effects, DCAs, media channels, mute groups, IP controllers, and AMM as well. So you can really go into quite deep resolution or granularity of what different users have access to, depending on what you want to give them in terms of access or not.
Thank you, Val. Another good question about the IP1 controller and whether Avantis has the same source selector settings and object in the software like DLive and AHM have in terms of giving quick access to different sources onto an IP1 wall plate for any user in a house of worship to select the background music, for example, or other sources?
Sure. Yeah, so let me show you again. Sorry, let me just get that back up. There we go. So again, in the audio and source selector menu, you have access to a source selector the same as you have in DLive. And then in the controllers tab, we have IP1, IP6, etc. And we can assign an IP1 in the network and then apply a source selector to that IP1. So pretty much if you know your way around source selectors on DLive, sorry, you'll find your way around on Avantis as well.
Very good. And David is asking, hi David from Summer, is asking any tip for using AMM in a house of worship application?
Yes, so I didn't touch on AMM because it's quite a large topic, and I'm wary of the time. But yeah, we have AMM on Avantis as well, in the same as we do on DLive and SQ as well. So not specific to house of worship, although it is a really good tool. So for those that don't know, AMM is our auto mic mixer. This allows us to assign a certain amount of microphones or input channels to the AMM, and it will prioritize the inputs with the highest gain level. So basically, if we've got 8 microphones assigned to the AMM, it will detect which microphone is the one that someone's speaking into, and it will turn down the other microphones that aren't being used. Now, where this is really suitable for house of worship is because house of worship are typically fairly large rooms. Sometimes they can be quite reverberant, have a lot of background noise. So it really allows to limit the amount of echo that you'll have, or of reverb that you might have in other open microphones. So it turns those down, and it only gives you the most direct source, which is typically the source where someone is talking into a microphone. And again, there's plenty of tutorials on AMM on YouTube to learn more about how to use it. But it is a great tool for house of worship as well, because it allows to simplify the workflow a little bit, and especially in situations where you have multiple sort of speech microphones open at the same time. So yeah, AMM is a great tool for house of worship, and it's available on Avantis, of course.
Right, so you talked about virtual sound check a few minutes ago, and Deezy is asking whether you can use the USB recording and playback for virtual sound check multi-track, or is that stereo only, and what other options you have for multi-track?
Sure, good question. Okay, so on Avantis, USB is not available for multi-track recording, simply because there are limitations in channel counts on a USB port, the amount of channels that we can stream, and it doesn't really make sense to only allow you to have 16 or 32 channels of audio recording on a 64 channel mixing console. So for that reason, it is through card slots that you can do multi-track recording, and depending on the card you choose, you can do multi-track recording over Dante if you're using one of our Dante 64 or 128 channel cards. Our Waves card allows multi-track recording and playback as well with virtual soundcheck, but you might also want to record over MADI. There's even an Ether sound card that you could use if you wanted to. But so there are various different options. However, on the USB front, something that is quite nice, and it is a feature that I find quite practical, is that on Avantis we don't actually record directly to a USB key. There's actually a flash memory inside the console that you record to, and then you export that recorded audio file to USB key if you want to take it somewhere else. Now, where that's really nice is that you can also load audio files into Avantis onto that flash memory and have them in the console for playback at any given time. So you might want to store a pre-recorded message into Avantis, like you know, please take your seats, or like please remember to switch off your mobile phones, or a background music track that you want to have playing, and you can have all of that stored in the console, so you don't need to think about having a laptop with all the audio files inside it or something. You can have that inside Avantis, and it's not something that will disappear if somebody takes a USB key away. So it's a really nice feature to have, to be able to record stuff directly into the flash memory, but also import audio files into that memory as well. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so there are some more coming in. I think what we'll do, Val, because we're coming up to the hour now,
Sure.
I'll pick up maybe one last one, and then we can get back to some of the other questions and users offline after the webinar, and send a reply to each and every of you. Now, last question, Matthew is asking if you can give an example of where to use ganging as opposed to a fixed stereo input or stereo pair.
Sure, very good question as well. So just a bit of background, if you like. So input channels can be mono or stereo. So we mentioned we've got 64 input processing channels, and if I decide to make an input processing channel stereo, it uses 2 of those 64 input channels. Kind of makes sense. We're taking 2 and we're linking them together as a stereo input channel. Now, what that does when I link 2 channels together as a stereo input channel is it links all of the parameters like gain, EQ, compression. It links them all together, so I don't have independent control of my left and right channels. Now, that's very practical for music track playback or keyboards or any stereo channel that I might want to only need 1 fader for rather than 2. It reduces my layout on the mixing console in terms of how many faders I need. But it does have a drawback, or maybe ganging has an advantage. So what we do by ganging is essentially we're linking 2 channels together, but we're linking the control parameters, so what I can see on screen. So I can gang 2 channels together where I'll gang the faders, so I move 1 fader and they both move at the same level. But I can still choose to leave other parameters independent. So I can have a different EQ on my left and right. I can have different gain on my left and right. I can have different compression parameters on my left and right. And that gives me a bit of liberty into what I might want to do. So I might want to gang my overhead microphones on a drum kit left and right, for example, because they need a slightly different EQ, but I want to have them always at the same level together, so I can gang the faders so that they're always, so you can see you've got more flexibility on a gang, but it takes up more real estate. The other reason you might want to use a gang that I've used it before is, for example, on the keyboards, if you're doing stage changeovers and maybe a pad gets taken off one of the DIs and not the other, I might, on a stereo channel, I've only got 1 gain, whereas if I don't link my gains on a gang, I can quickly do 20 dB gain change so that my input levels are on are the same, even though the pad's been triggered on a DI, if that makes sense. So ganging is more flexible. It gives me the possibility to separate certain parameters of my processing and have them different on 2 channels while still having them linked together for certain other parameters, where with a stereo channel, everything's linked. It's all, you only got 1 set of settings and that's it. So hopefully that answers your question.
That's great. I think we answered most of them, and as I said, we'll make sure that we address all of the questions offline anyway. So thank you very much, Val.
Great. So again, thank you everyone for attending. It's been a pleasure talking to you for the last hour. Please take a look at our website if you've got any more questions about Avantis, or speak to your local distributor. Of course, they'll be more than happy to help. We will have another House of Worship webinar focused more on DLive in the next few weeks, so keep an eye on our social media for news about that. And I look forward to hopefully being able to meet you in person in the near future. So thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your day.